Hello, this is the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and I am Gabrielle Hurd. The date is July 17th, and we are here with, can you state your name?
Cynthia Wilson.
Excellent. Would you mind spelling that for the record?
Sure. It's Cynthia Wilson.
Thank you. And today we are at the Legacy Museum at Tuskegee University and the Tuskegee University Archives. Would you mind telling me about how you started working at the Legacy Museum?
Let's start with how I started. My history is a little bit different in relationship to this institution. Both of my parents were graduates of Tuskegee. This place was my playground when I was 10 years old, because my mother was director of nursing service when this was actually a hospital and a functioning hospital. I'm also native to this area. I am the descendant of slave and slave owner of Macon County. Both of my maternal grandparents were born in Macon County, as well as my maternal and my grandparents' parents were both born in this area. So my roots date back to roughly 1840, the founding of this community of Tuskegee, which is 1836. So I'm deep into the roots of this community. I've never not been in Tuskegee. I grew up a couple of years living on the campus. As a matter of fact, where it is the North Commons used to be Pinehurst Hospital. And when it closed as a hospital, it was turned into apartment. And I lived in those apartments as a kid. My mother was not supposed to have a kid. At least she was informed that she would probably never have children. And I literally exist because of the OBGYN who worked at this hospital at the time that my mother got pregnant. I was not born in the hospital. I was born in Hartsville, Alabama, which is right down the road from Huntsville, Alabama. But all of my mother's prenatal care was at this hospital. I started working for the university in the 1980s. I worked initially for the library in the processing area of the library. I did book ordering. I worked for the vet school library for a couple of years before transferring back to the main library. And then I left and worked for an attorney for 2 years before coming back, and when I came back in 1993, I started working in university archives. I was Daniel Williams' archival assistant until he retired in 1999 with the presidential apology for the syphilis study. The archives is a part of the grant that was given to the university, which is partly responsible for the renovation of this building into a classroom space. The archives and museums went under the Bioethics Center. So from 1999 to 2007, I was a coordinator of archives and museums for this space. So I actually had the responsibility of designing the space that the museum sits in and designing the space that the archives sits in. This was a wreck, just to put it mildly. because it was left over as a hospital facility, and then it had been used for doctor's offices. So and then in 2007, I went exclusively under the Bioethics Center as the resource and public information officer specialist for that area. My job was to talk about Tuskegee's history in medicine and science, particularly focusing on the U.S. public health study of untreated syphilis for Negro male. And I stayed there with the Bioethics Center till 2013 when I retired. And last year in April, due to a shortage of applicants or people to work in the museum, and the then director of the museum, Dr. John Teal Robinson, was taking some time off for an NEH grant that she had received to do some research. I was asked to come back to work in the museum. So technically, I've only been back here a year in terms of being in the museum itself exclusively. But I have, as you can see, a different history in relation. I moved all of this stuff over here from different places. We hadn't had a museum on the campus since the Carver Museum was transferred to the National Park Service. So a lot of our holdings were spread all over campus. I got the wonderful job of finding it all and getting it all over here. The library went through a renovation in 2000, so the archival collection ended up being in different places, and we ended up in a converted dormitory. When they moved back to the library, because we were not scheduled to move back there, we were scheduled to move here. So I got the joy of moving it out of the main library into storage, up the hall in this dorm, and then getting it all over here. So I'm a little attached to this stuff in ways that other people are not, because I moved it 3 times.
I'm interested in you were involved in the designing of this space.
Yes.
How did growing up here and growing up in this building inform the way you wanted to design it?
Basically, Mr. Chandler's office was my mother's office as director of nursing service. The office that the museums used to be a lab. One of my colleagues once said, I knew where all the bodies were buried when it comes to this building. When my mother came to it, it affected a lot of it, of how I saw the building, but it also affected how I asked for certain things, because you couldn't tell me what the space was or was not, because I've been playing in the building since I was 10. So, I was familiar with where things were, where spots are, how to maneuver the building in different ways. I had my daughter here after they renovated and raised the old original building. I have memory lapses, or I should say, I can stand in a hall outside of the archives and remember where the old building was and how I used to maneuver through this building. There's a side on the other side. There were 2 other buildings over there, 38 building and 32 building. And when I was a kid, you couldn't go up on the floors until you were 13. I was only 10. So I had to negotiate, the lobby and the areas where I could be without going to the actual wards, because I wasn't allowed on the wards. So I learned to work old plug switchboard, because I talked as much then as I talk now. And students used to work the switchboard, and I talked the student to death one day until she finally taught me how to work switchboard. So I have a lot of memories. I knew Dr. Dibble. I knew Dr. Mitchell. I knew Dr. Campbell. These men are not just names to me. They are people I have direct association with as a kid.
Ms. Wilson, so we were saying earlier that I first met you when I was a grad student at Duke, coming down to do oral histories of the Behind the Veil Project. So it's just so great to see you again. And, I'm interested, you've been talking about the artifacts, kind of the physical makeup of the building. And could you talk about the importance of storytelling and oral history in kind of building up the museum?
There are what I call truths, myths, rumors, legends, and lies when it comes to any institution. And all of it becomes important to collect, and then it becomes the stuff that you can document, the things that you have heard enough times from who you may consider a credible source in establishing exactly what the story is. And even with the rumors and the lies, it sometimes becomes important to figure out why that gained any traction. And this institution has a lot of it when it comes to the people who were here when Booker T came. Sometimes people don't realize that their stories are important, and sometimes it comes in verifying. I've been lucky. I was able to interact with people who actually were still alive during Booker T's time. And that became important. Accidentally, when I was pregnant with my daughter, who is now 40, my grandfather all of a sudden came up with a story that none of us had ever heard, because he was a young man living in Shorter, which is about 15 minutes down the road from here. And all of a sudden he decided to say, I remember when they said that Booker T was coming back home and that he was dying. And it was like, what? He said, he said it spread that he was coming back, they were bringing him back on the train. He said, I wanted to go see for myself. So my grandfather actually walked from Shorter, which is where the racetrack is, to Tuskegee, to the train station, which no longer exists, but it was over by where the Bremer building is now on campus, just so he could see for himself whether, Booker T come in on this train. And I had never thought about the fact that my grandfather actually saw Booker T. Washington as a kid until that moment, because he didn't attend Tuskegee. He only had a third grade education. He had to drop out of school and work the fields. So my grandmother finished high school. She and a couple of her sisters, they actually either got to the 9th grade or the 10th grade, and my grandmother actually finished the 12th grade. But I never thought about the fact that they actually functioned within the same space as Booker T. Washington until that moment. And we had a running argument with a historian who works at SMU, Dr. Kenneth Hamilton, as to whether or not Booker T was still alive when he actually arrived here. And we couldn't find anything to verify it one way or the other. And my grandfather said he looked dead to me when they took him off the train. And the word was he died after he got in the house. So for years we went back and forth with, Daddy Joe said he looked dead to him when they took him off the train. Your granddaddy wasn't but 15, 16 years old. How would he know the difference? And finally, with getting Dr. Kenny's papers, we realized he was near death when they took him off, because he died 4 hours after he got here. So yeah, those stories become crucial to understanding the campus and some of the things that happened. And I had some wonderful people over the years who were able to fill in the gaps for me. Ms. Corrine Steele, who was a child when her husband Frank Steele was a physician here, but she was a child she was about 8 or 10 when Booker T died. You interviewed George Pugh for the Jim Crow Project, and Ms. Pugh was like 6 or so. So there were certain things she didn't remember. Mr. Mike Rabb, who he was about 103. He came to the university when he was 12. Colonel Welch, who grew up, his parents taught here, he grew up going to school, but he was one of the few students who was a kid, because a lot of the students over the years were actually adults. So when you look in his yearbook, you see this, this kid's picture with all these grown people. But he lived in 96, and a lot of times I could piece together questions that came in the archives by who I called and when they came. So I got a call in reference to one of the photographers once, and I called 2 or 3 people, and he wasn't here when they got here. And I called Mr. Welch, and he knew exactly who I was talking about. He graduated in 1923, but when I got to Mr. Rabb, who came in 1927, the gentleman wasn't there. So now I know he was still here in 23, but he was gone by 27. So those stories become real crucial in trying to piece together things that you may not be able to have documentation for.
Have you been able to do interviews or kind of use the stories that are still here about the earlier years to kind of improve the narrative of the museum?
I use it, I use them often. Mm-hmm. I grew up with these dioramas. They were a part of the Carver Museum. Ms. Middleton, who I believe you're talking to, also grew up with them. She was like 5, and she remembers the gentleman who was who brought them back, Charles Dawson. Well, he left in 51. I was born in 51, so I have no idea of Mr. Dawson. But I do know Elaine Thomas. And in trying to get information relative to the dioramas in the last few years, one of the things that we ended up between Ms. Middleton and I, because there's about a 10-year gap in our ages, we figured out was we don't ever remember them not being up. And then it was who actually grew up seeing them. I knew my daughter hadn't, because when we came back here to live, I actually took the kids over to the Carver Museum, and that's when I found out that they were no longer a part of the museum exhibition. And it was like, what happened to them? And then, so we were able to, but then I have a cousin who's 10 years younger than I, and when I asked her if she remembered them, because I'll be 72 in September, and so last year she's 60, I'm 70, so it's like, when's the first time you saw the dioramas? And she came in and she said, I've never seen them. So all of a sudden we figured out that if you were 60, 61-ish, you probably never saw the dioramas in the Carver Museum to actually remember them. I'm pretty sure they were still up when she was a little, but not old enough for it to have made an impression on her. But if you were maybe 65, 70, in that age range, then you remembered the dioramas. So yeah, we use stories all the time, or verification. Pick up the phone. There is still one lady here in town, if you can get her to answer the phone, who just celebrated her 103rd, 104th birthday. Wow. And she is a fountain of information. But again, she's at an age now where she don't want to answer the phone, she ain't answering it. So it's it's whether you can get her to answer the phone, and once, usually, she will be able to fill in the gaps or give you an idea of what kind of documentation you actually need to go to look for certain things.
Ms. Wilson, what kind of a person was Dr. Danny Williams? I mean, he was our supervisor in '94, and I just remember him as just having a tremendous store of knowledge. Could you talk about him? Danny
came to Tuskegee in the mid-'60s. He came with a degree in history and library science, and then he went on to get a ED at Auburn. He was very vested in Tuskegee's history, and he was very vested in the activities. So he worked a lot with the convocation programs, with collecting information, particularly books. The first time I met him, he walked in with about 4 or 5 carts of books that he had gotten from somebody in Mobile, and he worked very actively in the community in relationship to trying to foster keeping the history of the community itself alive. Unfortunately, he ended up with Alzheimer's. And so that was, the last couple of years was a little shaky in relationship to it, and sometimes things didn't come out quite right. So we got to a point that he started to transfer a lot of stuff to me. But he did a lot to, particularly with the Washington collection, to add books and resources to that collection, which is housed, it used to be attached to the archives. But with the Bioethics Center grant, they separated the Washington collection and the archives, and then put the archives and the museum together as a unit. And the Washington collection stayed with the library. Mm-hmm. We can keep going just a little bit. I gave 15 more minutes. I told you I love to talk.
So I just have one more question, then I'll pass the mic down.
Okay.
So now you've been referencing some wonderful people who have been very important in preserving the history of this university. Are there other folks that come to mind who you've been able to work with over the years that deserve acknowledgement in terms of keeping the history of the university?
Sure. Booker Conley, who both of these individuals are deceased at this point, but Booker T. Conley was a former student at Tuskegee. He, ironically, I didn't find out till later, he and my dad were in high school together. He was originally from Birmingham, but he was a little younger than my father. He was actually in buildings and grounds. So he dealt with construction in relationship to it. And he eventually became the head of buildings and grounds before he actually retired. When he retired, Dr. Payton did not let him off they put him on as a consultant. And for years, he and a woman by the name of Elaine Thomas, who grew up on his campus, her father was Marcellus Freeman was, and I hope I'm pronouncing his first name correctly, but he taught art. And so she grew up, and there are pictures of her with Dr. Carver. She knew Dr. Carver as a kid. And often talked about the relationship she had with Carver as a kid, and she was an artist, and she was a curator of the Carver Museum. When they did that transfer of the museum of the Carver material to the Park Service, they had to keep the rest of this stuff. And so it did not go in sometimes the most ideal conditions for preservation, but a lot of it went up on a floor and physical plant. And for years, Mr. Conley was the only way you could get to the items that were from the museum. He only had the key. I was 51 years old when I called him to ask if he would meet me at physical plant because I needed to check some of the things at the collection, in physical plant. And he actually told me, come by the house and get the key. And I went, I'm grown. I am finally grown because he is trusting me with the key. So yeah, there have been over the years, too many people to name, who actually have guarded the history of this institution and its possessions. And Booker Conley and Lane Thomas are the ones that I think about the most, because with a combination of the museum and the items in here, I knew when I got a call, I was being instructed. This is what you are going to do. It was not a question, it was an order. Upstairs, you'll find James Henderson's picture. Dr. Henderson, after he realized that Dr. Williams was slipping, all of a sudden started to, we pick who we feed information to. And I got picked. And I knew I got picked when he called me at 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday to talk about stuff. So that's, that and like now they're all gone and I'm them. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
This is Lorna Ministry, and I wanted to ask earlier when we were talking before we started recording, you said that the exhibits that are up on the second floor, that they should never be referred to as the Tuskegee experiment. And I wanted to know if you could explain once more why it's so important to not refer to them as the Tuskegee experiment.
Okay. To start with the first thing that I found out that when I started working in the archives in '93, the Tuskegee experiment is the official governmental designated name for the Tuskegee Airmen Training Program. That is what it's called. And it is stated in such a way that they viewed the training of Black pilots as an experiment because they didn't think we were capable of either intellectually or physically of handling what was involved with flying a plane. So it was viewed as an experiment in that sense, and seemed to be kind of designed hoping it was going to fail. Okay. That was kind of crazy since Chief Anderson taught himself to fly, and he was one of the people who was training these pilots, particularly people who had no flying experience. And a lot of the guys who came did have some training prior to joining the military. So that's the first thing. And back in '93, it was still at times designated as the Tuskegee experiment. People confuse the two. The official name for the study is the United States Public Health Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male in Macon County, Alabama. And at one point, there was this effort to try to separate the institution from the study. Well, we can't do that. There's no way to actually separate Tuskegee from the study. But the implication also to people is that every man in the study was from Tuskegee. They were not. They were from Macon County and some of the counties bordering Macon County, because this is slave country, and a lot of times, or former slave country, and a lot of times the border between the plantation and the land being worked is very slim. So it'll mix between Lee County, Montgomery County, Tallapoosa County. Bullitt County was carved out of part of Macon County. So there's an interconnection that may occur, that where these men may not have all come exactly from Macon County, but it's kind of like, I had a couple in this morning with their children in Colorado. I had grandchildren who live in New Mexico, and it's at a place called that's close to Four Corners, you know, and my grandmother had this postcard that my uncle sent once that said, I'm in New Mexico, but my ass is in Arizona. And it has him standing in New Mexico with a donkey in Arizona. And that's kind of what you're dealing with here. The big house may have been in Montgomery County, but the slaves were in Macon County, because this was a county that was 85 to 90% black. Okay. So that it's important to make that designation to first separate the airmen from the men who were involved in the study. Because ironically, people sometimes confuse the two. I actually had a gentleman argue me down that the airmen were given syphilis. And I finally had to tell him that he called me for some information. I didn't call him, and his information was incorrect. So it became important to make that clarity so you didn't confuse the two. The second part of it is, it's not an experiment in the traditional sense of the word. Most people have a misconception that the men were infected purposely. They were not. And there is no documented evidence that there was any effort to deliberately infect these gentlemen with syphilis. And that leads to that misinterpretation of it being an experiment. Okay, what is bad enough as what it was. You don't need to make it any worse. Like I was explaining to you guys, it started as a part of something that was done in 1929, that the stock market crash and the loss of funds from the Rosenwald Foundation, when the Rosenwald Foundation getting out of healthcare, because a lot of people don't realize that the Rosenwald Foundation even dealt with healthcare. They are known more for education. So them getting out of it, it was narrowed from those 6 states that it originally started in to here. And the narrowing here is not as black and white as most people want to make it. It is 1,000 different shades of gray that lead from black and white and a mixture. We can't deny our participation, because then it denies part of our history with the Public Health Service. And it denies part of the positive history to some extent that we had with the Public Health Service. Booker T started a movement known as National Negro Health Week, which started in 1915, or 1914, which is just prior to his death. In collaboration with who became the second president, Robert Moton. The Public Health Service was involved with that. They sponsored it. It was a national program. It is now known as Minority Health Month, but it started out as National Negro Health Week. And so the Public Health Service funded and underwrote a lot of that. This hospital had an organization called the John A. Andrew Clinical Society. The John A. Andrew Clinical Society was a place where black physicians, for 1 week out of the year, around Booker T's birthday, which is April 6th, what he chose, and for that week, information in terms of treatment, new theories, new ideas in medicine were exchanged between black and white physicians in this state. 1 week, everybody forgot the segregation laws. They met here. And that information was exchanged. Public Health Service was involved with that. With the extension program, Thomas Monroe Campbell starts as the first black extension agent in 1906. Eventually, because of the conditions that he ran into going out into the field, he adds a home demonstration nurse, a home demonstration instructor, and a nurse, one of the first public health nurses in the country. Who paid for that? Public Health Service. And one of those, the third of those nurses was Eunice Rivers, who worked with this study. Do you see the interconnect and how it begins? There was no public health office in this county. So Booker T got them to put a public health office at John A. Andrew Hospital. John A. Andrew Hospital for years treated most black folk from 27 of the 67 counties in the state of Alabama, including people as far north as Tennessee, as far south as Florida, as far east as Georgia, as far west as Mississippi. If you were black and something was happening with you, a lot of times you came here. It was one of the few hospitals started by blacks, run by blacks. The VA hospital was built on 299 acres worth of Tuskegee University property, donated by Robert Moulton for the purpose of serving African-American soldiers coming back from World War I. You get the problem we got here with making it just a good-bad scenario in relationship to it. Now, was it bad? Yes. Was it racist? What wasn't in 1932? You know, the fact that anybody even asked that question to me is insulting. You are talking about the Alabama Black Belt in 1932, and you gotta ask if it was racist? Okay, that to me is infuriating. Of course it was. In relationship to it. What makes it worse is the idea of eugenics, which was the study, this whole idea of there being dramatic differences between these pseudo classifications of race that existed under eugenics. And this study is in the middle of it, being conducted by men who came through the University of Virginia, who taught this as a true science. So yeah, we got some racism going on here in relationship to it. Did they inform them? That part bothers me, because it's not like informed consent was the norm of medical practice at that particular time. The question becomes, did they lie to them? They did, because the protocol for the study was to follow the natural progression of the disease to autopsy. Let's go back there again. The natural progression of the disease to autopsy. Ain't but one way to get to autopsy. So you never intended to treat. And yet you're telling them that you're going to treat them. So yeah, that's where my issues come in relationship to it. It's bad. Our participation in it and the participation of black doctors cannot be denied. It was the best kept secret, you know, in medical profession at the time. There are way too many reports written on it. There are way too many things that are done for anybody to say they didn't know it was going on. When you blame the community, you get a problem. Because if you've been on this campus, you really expect somebody in the library to know what the heck was going on in the hospital. And my answer to anybody with that is, if you can tell me what's happening on the 3rd floor of the most populous hospital in your community at any given moment, if you can tell me what's happening on that floor, then I'll explain to you, I will answer why the community did not respond. Because that's something all of us need to be aware of. How much do we know about what's going on in our own communities? That should be a warning to you, not a criticism of the people who are necessarily there. And the other thing that you need to get out of the study and an understanding of it is that informed consent that you were talking about, they didn't get, you get it because of them. That's what you get. That's what they contributed to it, is the fact that you now have the right to that informed consent. Because had not Mr. Pollard decided to go to Attorney Gray, had not Attorney Gray decided to actually take that case on, and people need to understand, he put everything on the line for that lawsuit. Okay, a lot of things that you can criticize Fred Gray about, that ain't one of them. He put everything on the line for that lawsuit. And it was a contingency case. So if he had lost, he'd have lost everything in relationship to it. So if you don't get that lawsuit, you don't get the congressional hearings, you don't get the Belmont report, you don't get informed consent. You don't get the attention that it gets as something that everybody needs to be aware of. So don't feel sorry for these men. Feel grateful for the fact that they had enough, the ones who were left and their families have had the guts to stand up and fight for this. Because it was, if you're looking at it as if it was something that existed back then again, you need to understand something about medical history, or a little bit more about medical history and the development of medical research, so that you can understand that even after Nuremberg trials, for some reason Western medicine didn't think informed consent applied to them. That part I do not understand. How in the world, after the Nuremberg trials, do you not rethink what you're doing to see whether or not what you're doing falls under what Nuremberg is? Oh, well, you ain't Nazis. Oh, really? It didn't say that. It said you don't do human experimentation on people without their consent. It didn't say unless you aren't a Nazi. So those kinds of things are the things that bother me in relationship to it. And I'll thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I know you do have.
Oh God, I really are. Yeah, I'm all.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, then on behalf of the Sam & Proctor Oral History Program, thank you so much.
You are very welcome.
Thank you. Before we fully end, is there anything you'd like to clarify? Any final remarks you'd like to make?
No, it's a lot more information than I can say in a little while. And that's why, sometimes it's just kind of like, and I'm passionate about it because I've spent 30 years having to try to fill it, and be fair to these gentlemen. I got a chance to meet some of them. And once you've been around them and you've been around their families, you got an obligation to get this right and to use any analogy that you make in relationship to the study. You need to get it right and not just assume in terms of it. So, my passion comes out of that. I don't want them misrepresented. And I hope to God that I have never misrepresented them. That's basically it.
All right, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was nice.